All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Erica Castillo. I am the co-founder and director of the California Small Fitness Facilities Association. I have my co-founder here, Maria. She'll do an intro in a moment. And we have our amazing guest speaker, Joel Erb with Pioneer Law Group. This is the California Small Fitness Facilities Commercial Lease Best Practices webinar part 2. We want to thank our partners, the City of Sacramento, the MetroBusiness Center, and SAC IEDC for making this webinar series possible. For everyone who has attended, if you can right now in the chat, put your name, the name of your business or company that you're with. I know we have some PBID people, city people, regional transit's a good mix today. So if you can put in the chat kind of the main questions that you're looking to get answered today, and if you currently own a commercial space or if you're in the stage where you are looking for a commercial space, that would really be great to know. One thing I really want to emphasize today is that Joel Erb is not going to be giving one-on-one legal advice in this, so please do not direct message him with any of your legal questions. So if you can put just your general questions in the chat. And if you have a question that you don't feel comfortable with having the whole group know about, feel free to private message that question to me or Maria. Maria, if you want to do your intro, that would be great.
Unmute. Hello, everybody. So my name is Maria. I'm one of the co-founders of the California Small Fitness Facilities Association. I am also a business owner, and this webinar series is sort of near and dear to me because I have been through sort of all the phases of owning a small business when it comes to negotiating leases. So I started my business in 2014 with a 1,200 square foot space. And since then, a lot has happened. Throughout that time, I had dealt with tenant improvements. I've expanded my space. I've renegotiated my lease 3 times. I've moved spaces. I've purchased my own commercial building where now my business is. And now I'm also a landlord. So I come from this perspective of, you know, just having lived through the experience on the tenant side. So I'm really happy to be here and with Erica and Joel, kind of giving you some general guidance and hoping to answer your question no matter what stage of business you are in. So one thing that I learned from my experience really, the biggest thing that I learned really is that, you know, your contractual, you know, your lease establishes this contractual relationship. And, you know, your landlord may change, your situation may change, your financials may change, the pandemic can happen, but this lease is really where you go to when things get difficult, when you have to deal with certain situations that come up. So it's so important to be very diligent about knowing what's in your lease, negotiating your lease in the beginning, and really having a document that you understand. So that's what we're here to do. And I guess I will a little bit introduce Joel, although Joel already was introduced by Erica. Joel has personally helped me with my leases. I've worked with him through a variety of different avenues. And the nice thing about Joel is that he represents tenants, which is often difficult to find, in addition to, you know, all the other real estate experience that he has. So I will let him say a couple of words as well.
All right, thank you. Yeah, my name is Joel Erb. I'm an attorney here in town. I've been doing this for about 25 years now. Started practicing in New York City and moved back here to Sacramento about 20 years ago. I represent a lot of large companies, the Kings, Tom Ford. But I also, probably my favorite thing is to represent small businesses here in town, because small businesses here kind of make the city what it is. And I have my own small business, my firm. I own my building. I deal with some of the same things myself. So I'm always happy to help out with small businesses here in town. So really happy to talk about these things because I deal with them all the time. Most people don't, and it can affect people's lives.
Thank you, Joel, for being here. So one last time for the folks that just came in, if you can put the name of your business in the chat, if you want to put your industry, whether or not you have a commercial space, or if you're looking for a commercial space, and then lastly, what your main question is. And again, if we can just direct the questions either in the chat or privately to me, but please do not send those directly to Joel. One last thing I want to mention, this is our part 2 series, but we do have the recording of part 1. So when we finish this meeting, I will send both recordings if you weren't able to attend the first one. This is our last commercial lease best practices webinar. We will move on to another topic next month. Teaser, it's going to be about AB5. So we'll email you all the information about the next one. And I think that's it regarding intros. Maria, do you want to get started?
Yes, I do. So today's goal is we decided to structure it a little bit differently than part 1 in that our hope is to review some of lease best practices, right? So that's why the question was, do you currently own a space or are you looking to open a business location, right? And so what we want to kind of have as a setup today are 3 to 5 things you should definitely look for in a lease before you sign, kind of like the big areas that you need to be aware of and you need to think about, right? And so that's our goal. And after each section of whatever we're going through, you can ask questions specifically about those areas that we're reviewing, but you're welcome, like Erica said, to drop some other questions either to the whole group or to her or to myself. So let's start with the very first thing here on our list, which is tenant improvements. So for example, let's say you are just starting and you're looking for a business space and you walked into one that you think that you love, and it is this, open space. It's an empty shell, as you would call it, and you can envision putting your business in that space. Now, you need probably a lot more than just walls and floors to do that. So who pays for these improvements that you will need to make this location yours, this business yours, right? And that's, probably the first thing that you will think about when you're entering into a new lease. What does it take to invest in this building and who pays for those investments? Now, as we'll find out today, there usually isn't a clear-cut answer on things, right? There's always gray areas, and especially for this one, there always are ways that you can negotiate. But the thing is to remember is that you can negotiate this aspect. So if the landlord says, well, that will be all of your responsibility, don't assume that, don't take that as, a given. There may be ways that you can negotiate certain tenant improvements. So when you are making these improvements, one thing we talked about last time, one thing to think about for sure is, are you going to be in that space for a long time or a short time? Are you thinking about signing a short-term lease because you're sort of, a lot of small business owners, including myself, when you see that 5 years, you're thinking, oh my God, I don't want to sign my life away for 5 years. Maybe I should do a short-term lease. So when you're thinking about improving the building, because guess what? Many of these improvements are going to stay with the building. They're not going to go with you. What are the questions that we get are, what are the typical things that the landlord should pay for versus I should pay for? The second thing is there room for negotiation here? What is common practice, right? So a lot of these improvements that, let's take a cafe, for example, it's more than just outfitting your kitchen, with a refrigerator and all the other equipment you need. I mean, there's mechanical work that needs to be done. There's structural work that needs to be done. And all of those components are going to obviously stay with the building. So Joel, I'm going to kind of turn it to you and ask you the question of, is there can we expect typical expenses that are the tenant's responsibility versus the landlord's responsibility in a build out. Let's say, for example, I don't know, someone had a restaurant here, so a cafe or a restaurant.
Well, I wish I could say that there was a typical answer, but I think that it depends. I think you've divided it correctly, because I think the argument on behalf of the tenant to the landlord is, I have to put in improvements for my business. I understand that that's my cost, but at the same time, I'm going to be improving your building. The value of your building is going to increase. So some of this is my responsibility, and some of it is just simply a benefit to you. So, if there's really structural things that need to be done, if there's repairs to the building that needs to be made, I think a fair argument can be made to the landlord that those are things that should be on the landlord side of the ledger. Obviously, trade fixtures related to your business are going to be the tenants. And things in between, painting, general improvements of the space kind of fall in between. And I think in terms of cost, a lot of times the costs are a heavy burden on a tenant. So even though the landlord might want the tenant to pay for it, there are ways that the tenant can shift some of the burden or delay some of the burden with the landlord. Typical things that the landlord might offer to the tenant would be free rent periods. So the tenant doesn't have to pay rent while they're building out, because that's somewhat unfair. You can't make any money. You're spending money on their space. You don't have to pay rent during that time. That's fairly typical. Sometimes the landlord will offer tenant improvement dollars to help improve the space. And usually there's some relationship between what that is and how much the improvements are for the specific business that are actually improving the value of the space. The other thing that can be done kind of out of the box things are things like, maybe having the landlord basically, amortize the cost of those improvements over time. As you say, look, landlord, can you pay for some of these improvements? But meanwhile, I'll pay, X% more in rent over the course of the lease. And that way, that's a way that I can finance these improvements that I couldn't do otherwise. And I'm going to be paying rent to you and you want that. So, you do have a little bit of leverage, especially when you are starting out, to talk about those things, because ultimately the landlord wants you in the space. They want the space to look nice. They want you to be successful, because that's good for both of you.
And Joel, in terms of timing, right? So some of us are getting into these businesses and this is our first one. We've never done this before. So how, in terms of what is the process of signing the lease / getting the cost estimates of all of these improvements? I would say, I would think, when you're thinking about, let's say, I'm just using the cafe restaurant as an example, before you sign and you say, okay, I will take care of all these costs and maybe you can add that to my monthly lease payments, which is super creative strategy. You're kind of borrowing from the landlord in that sense. But in terms of estimating the costs of that, I would say you can be doing things concurrently, right? You can get a contractor out to estimate what it would cost you to do the build out before you actually sign and do that, right? In terms of practicality, how do we even know how much things cost, right? It's like little steps at a time. You need to have a really good handle on what your actual improvements are going to cost, right? Before figuring out the exact strategy of how you're going to split all of those costs. For me, for example, when I was doing a small expansion, it wasn't a ton of work, but it was a lot of money for me at the time. I sort of made that argument to my landlord, which wasn't easy at the time because I did get a lot of pushback. It's not always going to be easy. That's to have these conversations, but you definitely can. We split some of the costs of flooring, for example, and window replacement, right? But the rest of it, I took that upon myself to do. So you could split things that way, very specific. As Joel mentioned, there are some big things you have some negotiating power on, such as redoing your HVAC, because now the building is going to be laid out a little bit different. So there's some mechanical engineering that needs to be done. And then there's things that are, yours. And so one thing that the other question I have for you, Joel, is how common is it to put in your lease after you leave, which items are yours and which items are the landlord's? You know,
So
like
that's an area that on smaller leases tends not to be negotiated very heavily, but it's always in there. You know, somebody, whether you read it or not, it's almost always in there. And it typically says something like, you know, the tenant will remove everything that it changed unless the landlord tells them that they can stay. But that can be negotiated up front. And I would actually recommend, if you're working with your landlord on the improvements, to kind of have like a list, you know, like work that out up front, because if there are particular fixtures that you definitely want to leave because it'll be expensive to take out, you want to make sure those are staying. And if there are things that are very particular to your business, now if it's just, you know, things that are easily movable, those are yours. The landlord really, in general, unless there's a really bad lease, won't be taken. But if there are things that get attached to the wall, but they're things you want to keep with you because they're personal to you, I would definitely call those out in the lease as your own personal property, understanding you're going to remove them and you're going to repair any damage that comes from removing them.
Right.
I think you described exactly right, you know, the timing, but I guess I would just mention, I think it's a great idea at least to have an estimate of what the costs are going to be before you sign the lease, because you need to know, you know, what you're in for before you're required to do it. And then you can have a sense of the landlord of what it's going to take. The other thing I would mention is, to the extent you have contractors or designers and a plan for the space, if you can get it approved before you sign the lease, then you know what it is you're going to build, and you don't have to already be on the hook for rent, go to the landlord and say, hey, can I do this? And then have them say no, and you have to start over. That's expensive. So anything that you can do before lease signing, you know, there's some risk because you don't have a lease, but I would definitely know what you're getting into before you're required to do it.
Right. There was a question about repeating some of the types of assistance that the landlords can provide. Something you mentioned after the pre-rent period.
I think that was the tenant improvement allowance.
Yes.
So sometimes you build into the lease, it'll say, there's many ways to do this, but it'll say something like, the landlord has offered the tenant a tenant improvement allowance of $50,000, you know, when provided with receipts and lien releases, the landlord will reimburse tenant. And again, the timing can be different. You can have them pay your contractors directly. Usually landlords like to wait until the end, but they can actually, you know, reimburse you or pay directly your costs, whatever you can negotiate for them doing. Now, not every landlord will do that, but that's part of the overall cost of the project, and you just have to build it into the cost of your business.
Right. On a small scale, right, if it's a small business that doesn't require a ton of improvements, you could probably negotiate directly, like I did in the very, very beginning, which was like, you do the, you know, you pay for the flooring and give
Correct.
the receipts, I pay for the paint, you know, this and that. And on a larger scale, if you have a bigger build out, something like what Joel is saying, a certain amount of dollars for a certain amount of, you know, type of project, they might not pay for your light fixtures, but they may pay for structural, mechanical, plumbing, those kinds of things.
That's exactly right. Tenant improvement allowance is a situation where the tenant's doing the work. You can also have it where it's landlord's work, where there's the flooring or the windows or specific things that you know that the landlord is taking responsibility for, or they should. The other thing I might mention is, you know, as a small business owner, you may not have a design team or a contractor ready to go to design out your space. But sometimes the landlords will. And sometimes you can have the landlords have their own contractor. You say, can you get someone out and estimate the cost for me? And that's a way to make the process easier. Of course, you have to understand that that contractor or designer has a relationship with the landlord. And all I would recommend is, in that case, some of the risk for cost overrun should be with the landlord if you're using the landlord's consultants or contractors.
So Erica, are there any other questions that you got specifically about tenant improvement, not maintenance? Because that will be in the next section we talk about. Is there anything we missed here, or anybody have questions about improving your space when you first move in or during a remodel?
Yeah, don't say anything about improvements, definitely about maintenance.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's a perfect segue into maintenance then. So if you already have experience leasing a space, you know that this is probably the area in your lease that you're going to the most, and this is probably the area that you're dealing with the most in your day-to-day life. I will say this from personal experience, that this has been one of the most stressful pieces of being both a tenant and now a landlord. Because if you spend any significant time in any space, there will be maintenance issues that come up, from small to pretty significant, and pretty significant issues that can impact you actually operating your business. So the big question is, of course, who takes care of the costs associated with emergency repairs? You know, things like heat and air, roof leaks, or even, you know, damage from those roof leaks. That I've had floods in my space a couple of times. And or things like, you know, someone throws a rock through your storefront window and you need to get somebody as soon as possible on site to fix it. So, you know, how do we take care of these issues as they come up? So of course, this is an obvious thing, but when you're first getting into a lease, the first suggestion is to look for a clause, of course, that specifically outlines who will handle specific types of repairs and or damage when big systems like HVAC, like plumbing, things like that, malfunction. And you may think that in the beginning, when you're just getting into it, that it's very obvious, right? My landlord is going to fix it, and they're going to fix it quickly because it's important to my business. I can't operate when my toilets are clogged, or, you know, I don't have air conditioning, which is something that was always happening to me. And my business relies on air conditioning. I cannot run my business without air conditioning. So when I was doing research about all of this and kind of figuring out what my rights were, you know, I was surprised to find things like, you know, in California, from my understanding, and, you know, we can talk about this too, if that's, you know, from my understanding, having air conditioning is not, the landlord is not required to provide it for me. That there's not a statute that I know of that requires that thing. And when I was getting into it, you know, I just assumed that my building was going to come with a really great air conditioner. So it's been my experience that, you know, what our expectations are not always what the landlord's expectations are, or what they are, you know, going to be responsible for, and the timing of how quickly they will fix things. So generally, it's pretty common from the leases I've seen, and Joel will jump in and talk about this, that, you know, exterior building damage and big system malfunctions usually fall onto the landlord to keep in good repair. Now, of course, there may be gray areas here, as there usually are, especially when it comes to, you know, something happening due to your actions, right? But let's say, you know, there's a roof leak, or all of a sudden the HVAC is not working. So first of all, we go back to the clause in our lease that talks about those things. So that's number one, is once again, this is the area that you need to focus on when you're reviewing your lease. And usually if the landlord is providing, right, they're providing water, they're providing air conditioning, if they are providing that, we would expect them to then repair it. So it is also typical for commercial leases to have clauses that say a landlord can take up to 90 days to repair something, and it has to be in writing. And you would be defaulting on your lease agreement if you withheld your lease payments to the landlord, if you chose to not, you know, to not pay the landlord if you didn't have a working air conditioner. So again, of course, you already know this, that's why you're asking about this, but a really kind of important area to look for. Okay, so generally, Joel, I will ask you, is there a statute or what's common practice, first of all, in how long a landlord has to make repairs. Is there a typical, is it 90 days typical? Is it 30 days? As far as the maximum amount of time that they are allowed to wait in order to fix something. And, you know, what can we expect that timing to be?
Well, I would say, so the lease is going to talk about what constitutes a default by the landlord. And I would say what is a default is different from how long they should take to do it.
Yeah.
I'm going to want to separate those things out because it's sort of, there's a legal standard and then there's a, you know, sort of like what a good landlord would do. So let's start at the top. I mean, if I'm a tenant, one of the things to think about here, kind of not kind of outside of what we're talking about, is insurance. Because if you do have some kind of problem to interrupt your business, one way to protect yourself, because your landlord might be slow, is to look at your insurance and see what you have in terms of protection, in terms of recovery, if you have a problem to interrupt your business. I would say that it's fairly typical that a lease will say that a landlord has 30 days with notice before they're in default of to repair. And if they're trying to repair but it takes longer, they have the extra time for it to take longer before they are in default. But just being in default just means that you have legal recourse against them. And at the leasing stage, you can negotiate various things like, one, you can accept out emergency. You can say, look, an emergency landlord has to be done sooner, or the tenant can do it themselves and charge the landlord. Most landlords won't go for that, but that's, it's sometimes in the market you're able to negotiate for that. In a commercial lease, it's really what the lease says. The second thing I'd say is a little bit depends on your business, because there are some businesses, for example, if you have a business, if you have an ice cream business and the landlord is responsible for the freezers and the freezers go out, your business is out. So one area you might have a better luck negotiating is where you say, okay, it's 30 days for general defaults, but if my freezers don't work, it has to be done in X time, or it has to be done more promptly, because that is a critical component of my business, and it really doesn't work if I have to wait up to 30 days for it to happen.
Right. And that brings us to kind of that self-help piece, right?
Mhm.
So you can negotiate,
Yes.
we're talking about what can you negotiate in the very beginning, and we'll get into like, what if you're already experiencing issues right now? But in the very beginning, you can negotiate things such as, if that critical piece, like for me, it's air conditioning, right? In a fitness studio, you can't, it's just not possible to not have air conditioning in Sacramento. So for whatever that your critical piece is, can you as a tenant fix the situation? And then can the landlord reimburse you for you fixing it if it's part of the thing that the landlord is responsible for, right? So my landlord did not go for that. He did not allow me to fix my own issues with the HVAC.
Mm-hmm.
But that is something that I tried to have happen because it was so critical. So, again, that would be something that I would really highly recommend for you to think about. What are the things that I can do? And is it okay? Would I be able to handle it faster? And could we build in, a reimbursement piece after that, if that's something that the landlord is responsible for? To do. It would be faster, and you would have a peace of mind if you were able to do that.
So we could talk about this for hours, but I have two responses to that. One is, you've identified something very important, which is HVAC is something that is not always very clear in leases. Just honestly, people don't think about it a lot. There's different components to HVAC systems and different setups with different tenants and different landlords. And it's not always crystal clear who's responsible for the HVAC. So I think that's just really important when you look at your lease, have clear with your landlord who's responsible for it. Because if it's you need to know that, and you need to maintain it and that sort of thing. The second thing is self-help. Let's start at the top. Do what's right for your business. So if the landlord is not doing something that they're responsible to do and it's impacting your business, then you make the best business decision you can. And look, I've just got to get this fixed. I'm going to pay for it now. I don't think I'm required to under my lease. But I would say, like, the business side comes first. Like, don't ruin your business just because the lease says X or the landlord won't do X. Like, you do what's right for you. Whether you can recover on that later is a very, kind of fact-based question on what does your lease say? How much notice did you give the landlord? You may end up with some kind of small claim against your landlord because you fixed something that they were responsible for. But I'd say that's sort of your second piece. Go to a lawyer and talk to about that. But the first thing is do what's right for your business. On third, check your insurance policy.
Yeah, and someone brought up the question of, there's a leaky roof in the building, and it was, I totally have been there. That's how I got the floods, right?
Mm-hmm.
And my landlord just every season would just do whatever little small repairs that they could, and every year we would have the same problem. I would have a flood. So unfortunately, I don't really know the answer to that question because we cannot really make the landlord do a big repair, right? Technically, they fix the problem by taking care of the leak, at least for a portion of the time. So they did what they were supposed to do, and
Right.
They're just kind of, putting a Band-Aid on the issue from your perspective, and you would like to have the problem solved long term. But unfortunately, I don't know that we have, a lot of say in how the landlord takes care of the issue long term versus short term fix, right, Joel?
Yeah, no, we don't have a lot of control. That's one of the downsides of being a tenant. Honestly, is that you are not responsible for it's a good and bad thing. You're not responsible for those things. And that goes back to, I'd say, landlords talk a lot about tenant selection, like trying to bring good tenants into their properties. But as a tenant, you need to have good landlord selection, right? Because it's a long-term relationship. And finding landlords and buildings that are well taken care of is half the battle. Because you get into the problems when you're in a space that's not well taken care of.
Right.
Real quick, I unmuted Daniel Savala, who was the one who originally asked the question. So Daniel, if you want to chime in on this piece.
Sure. Yeah, thank you, Erica. I appreciate it. So we've lost 2 businesses on Del Paso Boulevard over the last 18 months to roof repairs, for example, where the owner of the building did some minor roof repairs, but then there's severe damage to computer system and it's at a stalemate where the property, the business owner just left the space. And they reached out to us for, hey, what should we do? Is there any services that you guys offer? And it's kind of why I'm here today, just to kind of learn more about that process. But that's typically what we deal with, is who, and ultimately it came down to, does the property owner have a basic responsibility for a roof, per se, right? If we lease the building, is it habitable? I know for a residential, for example, it must be habitable, right? There's a legal definition to a habitable dwelling unit. Is there some similar definition of what is a leasable commercial space?
So I'm kind of hesitant to dive directly into your problem because I'm not, there's no attorney-client relationship and I haven't read the lease and there's a number of different factors there. So let me just talk generally. So most leases require the basic things that most leases require landlords to do are take care of the roof, the walls, building systems are pretty typical. That's why we mentioned HVAC, because it's kind of in between. It's kind of a building system, but it goes into premises, and that's one that gets complicated. But not all, I would say not always. Sometimes landlords can lease to a tenant and say, here's the building, you've checked it out, you're responsible for taking care of the roof. That's okay. You're 2 businesses, you can do that. So it really generally comes down to what does the lease say in that situation. So again, I would go back to, in terms of dealing with the individual problem, I would say, one, there's an insurance component there, right? Anytime there's damage, figuring out how to protect yourself from damage. 2, there's a lease issue of making sure that the landlord is responsible in the lease for the things you need the landlord to be responsible for. And then 3, there's an enforcement issue, which is if the landlord's not doing what they're responsible for under the lease, well, then there needs to be an attorney involved. Generally, I mean, I can't comment on your legal situation and whether there's some habitability issue there, but generally commercial is very different than residential. The only issue there would be if the landlord's responsible for something. And the thing that pops into my head is if the city, city building department says this is not a safe building, right? And it's not a lease in which the tenant has taken responsibility for the structure. Well, then that's a landlord issue clearly. And so then you've got kind of a couple different avenues. You've got sort of city building department as well as your own personal lawyer. That would be my kind of general thought on roof issues.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Very helpful.
Thank you for that question. That is something that I researched a lot as well as a small business owner, because you do feel hopeless sometimes and you're thinking, well, surely there is some standard, right? And then you realize that residential and commercial are completely different things. And the standards that we have for residential and commercial don't always overlap. And it is really frustrating, and I hope that you figure out a path forward and deal with that, because that's really sad to see the small businesses not only having to move but also suffering damages to their equipment, which that's difficult. So sorry having to deal with that. There's a question about a sink that doesn't drain and it's blocked and it's a common area space that's shared with tenants, and the landlord is saying to just use a different sink. Yes. I mean, I don't mean this. It's like, yeah, this happens so much. So again, it kind of goes back to who is responsible for maintaining that area. It goes back to your lease about the common area and then the plumbing. And I don't know how far you've gone to communicating with your landlord about the problem, what they said, how long the repair is going to take. So it's kind of an individual situation. It's kind of a specific situation, but again, it always goes back to who is responsible, how long the landlord has, and what has your communication been with the landlord, right? In that specific instance. Generally, common area is maintained by the landlord. We're going to talk a little bit about common area maintenance in a little bit, but it's the common area. So it's not just your responsibility. It's not the other tenant. It is the landlord, and the landlord usually either takes care of the cost themselves or in a way passes down that cost to the tenants through common area maintenance charges that you probably already pay if you have that in your lease, right? I don't know if there's, Joel, is there anything else to say?
Yeah, no, I would reiterate what you said, and I would just say generally, if you have an issue with common area maintenance and it's a landlord responsibility, you consult with a lawyer and or send the landlord a notice letter as required by your lease saying that they're in default of their maintenance requirements. As a lawyer, as I said, go see a lawyer, right? But I realize that there's not always a great answer. The legal system is here to help with those things. But yeah, that's why I'm always curious, Maria, what do you do in that situation? Because, you bump into that situation, you don't always want to hire a lawyer for a backed up sink.
No.
So again, then I go back to what makes sense for your business, right?
I fix it.
Yeah.
I usually would fix it. I would try to figure out the fix myself in a very inexpensive way. And even though other tenants use the space, I need the sink. It's an emergency for me. So I'm just going to fix it. If I can't, I'm going to try to find my plumber friend. If I can, I'll put money into it and hire a plumber if it's really, really valuable to my business. And then I will deal with my landlord and say, look, this is what I bought. This is what I spent. This is my receipt. This is common area. You need to reimburse me. I'll deal with the situation first, and then I will deal with my landlord, and it just all depends on the landlord and how they sort of handle that going forward after that. So it just depends. Small fixes, because I had previously not a great relationship with my landlord, I just ended up absorbing the cost of that. And that is the unfortunate sort of reality of being a tenant, in that, it's not a black and white, and you don't always, like Joel said, get a great landlord. And, even if you do have a great one, they can sell the building, and then you can have a different landlord in the middle of your lease. Okay, so the person is saying it's a major blockage due to heavy trucks, possible broken pipe. So it could be a backup because of a really more of a complicated, bigger issue. In that case, if it's, plumbing and it's the main line, or if it's a big plumbing situation, that would have to be, in my opinion, that would be the responsibility of the landlord. But again, I don't know what your lease says specifically. And that's something that I would, again, defer to that specific portion in your lease on. And that's probably why your landlord is deferring maintenance, because it's probably an expensive fix, I would assume.
Should we segue from that into, is CAMS the next?
Yeah, absolutely. So, common area maintenance, right? So we talked a little bit about the definition of that at part 1, and we talked about a lease that, is what we would sometimes call a gross lease versus a lease that has additional payments, whether it's triple net that includes additional fees that the landlord may charge you, like property insurance fees that the landlord normally pays, taxes that the landlord pays for the building, and that can also include common area maintenance charges. Those are, the charge is a charge for things that you share either with other tenants. What does it cost to maintain an area that's not just yours and it's not just the other tenants? It could be like the front of the building, it could be hallways that are connected, it could be bathrooms that are shared, it could be sinks that are shared, those kinds of things. And some leases don't have charges. They're very clear about, this is what you owe and this is your monthly payment. And then some leases are less predictable, and predictability is kind of what we talked about as key. Like, what can you expect those charges, those extra charges, to be every month? And that's another area where tenants get tripped up, because they just don't expect these costs to fluctuate that much. So that includes, things like what we're talking about, the sink potentially. So basically the question is really, what avenue do we have for increasing predictability of dealing with expenses that the landlord can incur over time? So these could be capital improvement expenses, like the landlord, for example, repaved the parking lot and now is passing down those expenses to you, or their insurance costs went up and now they're passing down to you. But there are also, common area maintenance increases that can happen, because maybe the landlord is saying, now it's costing me more money, so now it's going to cost you $200 extra a month to clean the building, and that includes common areas. So it's like, what avenue do we have to make sure that once we're getting into the lease, we have a very clear understanding of how high can those payments be? Is there a cap on those payments? Or is it sort of like, is there a different way to approach capital improvements versus common area, just maintenance increases, right? And so, Joel, if you want to talk a little bit about that.
Yes. So if you hire a lawyer to negotiate a commercial lease for you, one of the key things in a lease that has common area expenses, one of the key things they'll be looking at is, what is the landlord trying to charge as those additional costs? Because even though we talked about, I think last time, the bad news is, whether you're doing a gross lease or a lease with common area expenses, as a tenant, you're going to be paying for it. one way or another, whether through the rent or through common area charges. The good news, though, is capital expenses that the landlord spends, to fix the pipes, to fix the roof, those should not be included in common area charges. And the rationale is this, or I'd say the most part, there's some exceptions we won't get into, but basically, if the landlord is spending money to improve the value of their property, whether it's they're doing something specific for one individual tenant and not for you, whether it's to put on a new roof, which makes their building instantly more valuable, those are not things the tenants should be paying for. A tenant should be paying for the maintenance of what's there in that sort of lease. And so that's what we try to negotiate so that that's clear in the common area maintenance provisions. And that protects you in certain ways, because then you won't have these giant charges that someone get stuck on your lease. In terms of tactics, I mean, you mentioned one of them. One way to make it more manageable in terms of budgeting is to ask the landlord for a cap on increases. Know what they're going to be going in, and ask for a cap of, okay, fine, I'm going to be paying you $100 a month extra for common area charges, but I want to know that 5 years from now, I'm not going to be paying $500. So, what that cap is completely negotiable. But, something like 5% a year is a pretty typical, reasonable cap that I've seen landlords agree to. But it's something to think about that not all tenants do think about as a way of creating some kind of predictability.
And you may get into a situation where you're feeling like your landlord is just passing down costs to you without any justification, right? You may get into that situation where all of a sudden you're seeing your statement, just has $300 extra dollars, $400 extra dollars, right? And it feels really stressful because you're feeling like you have to pay that because you owe CAM and that's a part of your lease. So again, I would say go back to the lease and push back, go back to the lease, read what it says, and push back when you feel like you can push back. It's happened to me in the past, and somebody brought up, electricity here, where, a big electrical bill was passed down to me, but then I went back to the lease, reread it 100 times, and realized that, I have, the landlord must provide me with proof of receipts
Yes.
for the last 12 months to show me that it was this particular time that actually that there was a big increase that happened. But because the landlord wasn't able to provide me with any receipts or any proof, they just dropped the issue. They came to me asking for money, but then they realized they have to provide something to prove it to me, and they dropped the issue. So you have to go back and kind of really, that's why it's so important to really understand what your lease says, so you can go back and look at that. And that goes hand in hand with your question about, you have 5 tenants and 1 electrical meter, and that's tricky because, if you're already in a lease and then you already signed a lease that already said, well, if you have 1 meter, right? I mean, if you have electricity costs that go up to this %, you're responsible for this and that. It's probably all in the lease. And if it's not in the lease, if it's not clear, then again, you can push back by asking specifics, asking for bills, asking for receipts. You can do that. It's just, we talked about utilities last time in our part 1. So I would encourage you to look at the part 1, because we talked about what are the different ways we can structure dividing utility costs typically. So so that you do have the kind of the power to, not just take those increases and absorb them and pay for them. You do have the power to kind of go back to your lease, evaluate specifically what it says. And most importantly, if you haven't yet signed a lease, this is an area that you really want to look at carefully, and either cap it or be very specific about what kinds of things you will be paying for. And if you disagree about, a charge, maybe there's a way that there's a process that's laid out, because what if your landlord says, well, it's actually going to cost $1,000 a month to clean common area. And you're thinking like, I know it's not $1,000 to clean that common area. I know that you could find somebody to clean it for 200, right? So be just very diligent in looking at that section.
I totally agree. I mean, ideally, you would get something in the lease that talks about your right to review that stuff. But if the landlord presents you with a bill, ask for backup, because ultimately they would have to prove those. The base rent's in your lease. Like, it's very easy for them to prove that you owed base rent. But if they were ever to try to enforce CAM charges against you, they'd have to prove those anyway. So for you going to them and saying, hey, I want to see the backup on this. I want to see the proof. I think that's absolutely reasonable. I'm glad to hear that you've actually had success doing that.
Mm-hmm. That one felt really good at the
Yeah,
time. I won that little fight.
Yeah.
We're going to jump into the next piece, but I did want to quickly address William's question about having a difficult time even getting a call back about a space because of the line of work that you're in. I would assume, and this is just an assumption, that some landlords may shy away from that because creating a studio space, I only know this because I just purchased a bunch of acoustic panels, is extremely expensive, right? So it could be to, outfit a space for your purpose, could be expensive, but I don't see why, in comparison to many other things, I wouldn't say it's more of a risk or more expensive. But I would say that if you're having a hard time even, reaching the landlord or getting any questions, answered, maybe they're not the most responsive, landlord, and maybe that's a sign in a way, I don't know. But you could try working with a leasing broker. And
that was exactly what I was going to say. Get a leasing
Yeah.
broker to deal with the landlords directly and sort out these spaces for you that knows what you're looking for, because they'll have a much better sense of the market, and it doesn't cost the tenant anything.
Right, and that's the thing that is really important. It won't cost you anything to work with a leasing broker. You wouldn't pay for that service. It's the landlord that would then pay, right? And so that could really help you a lot, and just get, because it's like a full-time job looking for a space and not getting answers and all these things. So hopefully that's helpful. Yeah, just going on LoopNet and calling around could be a difficult thing to do. So you could look into a broker. I mean, we could also follow up afterwards and recommend some leasing brokers as well for you. Okay, so we only have a couple of minutes here. So we did want to talk about how to deal with a pandemic-like situation. Now that is on our radar now. We've obviously lived through, those of you who have been in business during that time, lived through probably one of the most challenging times, as a business owner that you can live through. It is definitely that time that got us thinking, and somebody brought up a kind of a very specific question about this as well, about what happens when you're shut down, you are unable to pay rent or full rent because you're shut down. And what are your rights as a business owner, and what are the expectations, because you have to make the monthly payments according to your lease. And how do you get out of that? How to get out of that hole of not knowing what to do, and if your business can even survive, let alone pay monthly, or even have a bunch of payments that are sitting and waiting for you in case you do end up staying in business through one of the most difficult times that we've had to face, right, as business owners. So I guess the question that we get, Joel, is, is there something that, one, when we're just looking for a space now, that we put in the lease to sort of protect ourselves? And if you are in a situation currently, like what's the, we won't ask you any specifics, obviously, but currently, what is it looking like in terms of, this backlog of tenants who are going through the legal system because of all these payments that they owe and that now they have to pay for backlog of the rent? So kind of two-part question. Is there something
Well, on
you
the
can
second question, I mean, we'll know in maybe 5 years we'll be able to do a seminar on what happened in the courts to all of the the cases where is COVID a force majeure, in which situations and which leases. We kind of were flying blind through a lot of it, and so like many of you, we negotiated a lot of things on behalf of landlords or tenants based on what was going on in the moment. And but I would say the best thing to do now is, now that we know the kinds of thing that could happen, and hopefully won't, but could happen again around infectious disease, is it's ask the landlord and say, okay, and again, it depends on your business. If I have a business that requires people to come in and share the space, and I'm prevented from sharing the space because of government restrictions or infectious disease, how do we handle that? Does the rent automatically get halved? Like, I think it's worth having that conversation now up front, because before we had to have it in arrears. We had to have it in the past, kind of like on the fly. What do we do? Because the lease doesn't really deal with it. But I wouldn't expect that your force majeure clause, I mean, it might protect you. Force majeure is a general idea in the law that if I'm prevented from doing something I'm responsible to do by war, strike, hurricane, I'm not in default for being unable to do it. It was out of my control. But COVID was a strange thing because it was a combination of government restrictions, personal fear. Like it wasn't really dealt with in a lot of these clauses. So I think if you're in in a service industry where having customers come on site is important, I think you have those conversations with the landlord up front and talk about what happens in those situations, so you don't have to figure it out in the middle of it.
And it might be a little bit more generalized than we hope for. Like you might not come up with a solution like, if this ever happens, I won't pay rent, right?
Yes.
The landlord is not going to go for that. But maybe there's something about, okay, well, if that ever happens, can we negotiate the best possible situation for both of us, right?
Correct.
Could that be in writing?
Yes, yeah, you can definitely negotiate I mean, again, it doesn't, it's not going to answer everything, but you can definitely negotiate some sort of like, the landlord and tenant agree in the future about a reasonable, an equitable situation. If you can't agree on numbers up front, you can at least say, we acknowledge in the event of a pandemic, we will have to come back to the table to figure out how we go through it. If you can get something more specific, like, landlord, rent will be postponed for any period of time, which I'm not allowed to have people on site, but my lease will be extended by 1 month for every month that happens. I mean, there's all sorts of ways in your individual situation you can negotiate for that, depending on what your needs are. But now I think as a business owner, you'll have a better idea of what that is. Like, what if I'm only allowed to have 3 people on site and I usually have 15? I mean, Maria, you went through that. I mean, I think that we have a better idea of what those things are like. And I think we can probably proactively address some of them. And to the extent we can't, just like you said, I think negotiating a provision that says, in the event of a pandemic, it'll be treated as force majeure, or in the event of some kind of government restrictions on entering the premises, landlord tenant agree to take equitable actions to minimize the impact on tenant, or something that what to do if it happens again.
Just even having that conversation and having something in writing that says that you have to come to an agreeable solution is more than you would have had if you had never talked about it. And that would give you at least a little bit of, kind of something to cling on to in those times. Like, remember when we talked about that? So, so it looks like we are at the end of our chat. So Erica, I don't know if you want to kind of wrap it up now. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, there were a few questions that were directly sent to me, by the way. Some of them were a bit too specific that would definitely require legal advice. So I will send a wrap-up email that has the links to the first webinar. There was one question regarding how much a lease can increase within a certain amount of time. So keep an eye out for the email that I send with that information for those direct questions that were sent to me. These were so varied. So thank you so much for everyone who's been participating in the chat. It's really important that we're getting as many of your specific questions as possible without providing legal advice. So to wrap up, again, I want to thank our partners, the City of Sacramento, Sacramento Metro Chamber, Metro Business Center, the Sacramento Inclusive Economic Development Collaborative, so that's SAC-IEDC, in case you were curious. Again, I am Erica with the California Small Fitness Facilities Association, and the plan is we're going to be wrapping up this commercial webinar series, but our next webinar series will be regarding AB5. That's going to be on October 5th at 12 p.m. So please save the date. That's going to be a really great webinar, and we have an awesome speaker. We'll send you more information in the next email. I think one final question, Joel, if you don't mind, even though we're a little over, because we had so many people today that are looking for spaces. Do you have, I know it's like putting you on the spot, but do you have just like one piece of advice for anyone who's looking for a space right now? Like maybe a resource or something that you recommend people get connected to just be more equipped to get started on, you know, being as informed as possible during that process, I guess.
Well, I mean, we talked about this a little bit before and in the first seminar, but you know, two resources you should have as a tenant are a real estate agent and an attorney, and we do different things, and it's important to understand that we do different things. But your real estate agent can negotiate business terms for you, can help find a space, and you want to find someone who's familiar with the area that you're looking and the type of thing that you're looking for. So again, yeah, it's hard because, you know, there are retail brokers in Midtown, and I can't point you to one person and say this is the person, but you know, find a real estate agent. They advertise everywhere. Get someone who knows the kinds of thing that you're looking for in the area you're looking for. They don't cost the tenant anything because, and their job is to sign deals, right? So you're looking for a space, their job is to sign deals. That's a good match. An attorney's job is to protect you, give you risk assessments, try to give you information that you need to protect yourself and you know, manage your legal risks. So it's kind of a different thing that we do, and we don't always get along, but both of those things are very important as a tenant looking for space.
Awesome. Thank you, Joel, so much. We're going to miss you on our next webinar series, but you're more than welcome to come.
Okay, thank you.
I'm going to unmute everyone in case they want to say thank you. I put some links in the chat already to get to know more about the California Small Fitness Facilities Association and what we do. We provide technical assistance, grants, all that kind of stuff. So make sure you head to our website. And I put a link to the Metro Business Center to learn more about what resources they have. We're doing one-on-one consulting right now as well for small businesses. So make sure you take advantage of that. And feel free to respond directly to the email that we send later on today or first thing in the morning tomorrow, wrapping up this webinar. So thank you again, everyone, for attending. And
I just wanted to jump in and say, if you are unsure about what AB5 is, I know we just like throw that term around expecting all of the small business owners to know, but just in case you're not sure what AB5 is about, we're going to be having a detailed discussion about employees versus independent contractors. And that's a big hot topic, obviously, knowing what classification you are going to have people as they join your team. And we are going to have another attorney who specializes in that and actually was one of the attorneys on the case who made AB5 a law. So she knows this topic really, really well, needless to say. So that's what our next webinar is all about. Actually, we're going to have a two-part, I think, as well. So
Cool. Well, anyone who's unmuted, if you want to say hi, bye, it's opened up now. Again, thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Daniel. Good seeing you.
Yeah. Yeah, likewise. See you guys later. See you on the next
Thanks
one.
all. Take care.
Oh, good, good. All right, last chance.
Hi, everybody. Thank you.
Hi, Sing, sorry. I'll send you a link to that first webinar. I think that will answer your question.
Thank you so much. And
Thank you.
Have a good day, everybody.
Okay,
Bye.
thanks, Joel. Bye, Maria. Bye, everyone.
Bye.